Okay, thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Let me just run the quick intro bumper. And my guest is Dick Larson. He is with the Share International. Dick, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Charles. This is great.
So, Dick, let's first of all talk a little bit about Share International, who you are and what you guys are doing and what you're up to.
Sure. Thank you. I am a volunteer for Share International, which is a worldwide nonprofit educational organization who are in the footsteps of Benjamin Creme, trying to get information out to the world about the world teacher who is due to come before humanity any minute now. What happened while we're in this interview? Benjamin Creme, of course, is the source of most of my information. He was the latest revealer of the ageless wisdom teachings. The ageless wisdom is an ancient philosophy. It's not a religion. Ancient philosophy, as old as humanity, passed down first verbally and then in writing. The last two teachers of the ageless wisdom were a woman named Alice A. Bailey, who wrote about 20 books in the 1930s and 40s. And then the most recent, of course, was Benjamin Creme, who was the chief editor for Share International monthly magazine. And he traveled the world for over 40 years without any pay, giving out this information, which we're going to talk about today. Now, the coronavirus wasn't around when he was doing that, so the coronavirus information comes from the ageless wisdom.
Would it be safe to say that your group, in its modern manifestation, can be traced back to the work of Marina Petrovna Blavatsky,
Absolutely.
the Russian mystic of the late 19th century, who, along with Alcott, founded the Theosophical Society, which is headquartered in New York. Is that right?
Absolutely. She was the original early teacher of the ageless wisdom.
And that Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Trust, which changed its name to the Lucis Trust.
Correct.
Now, does that mean that you guys worship Lucifer?
No, not at all.
Well, then why the Lucifer Trust?
Well, Lucis means light, and that's the derivation for the name Lucifer, which is terribly misunderstood by most religions, especially the Christian religion today. Lucifer was a great angel. And
he was the dark angel, wasn't he?
No, that's the misunderstanding. And so, no, we're not based on Lucifer or Lucis Trust or any of that. We're a separate nonprofit that is about the world teacher Maitreya.
Okay, and Lucis Trust, of course, is still a major organization. It's connected to the United Nations. They run a meditation room at the United Nations. It's kind of like a world religion. I know you don't like to use the word religion, but it's sort of a world philosophy, if you will, that after World War II and the setting up of UNESCO by Julian Huxley, began to partake in sort of replacing the world religions with this new philosophy while leaving the trappings of all the various religions in place. Would you say that's true?
I don't know that much about Lucis Trust. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I doubt that they were trying to replace religions because theirs is more of a philosophy than a religion, as is ours. But Lucis Trust, they didn't think Benjamin Creme was right. They didn't think that Maitreya was here now, waiting for the right time to come forward.
All right, so let's then talk about your idea of Maitreya. I mean, it sounds to me like this is a messianic movement. It's similar in a way, I suppose, to the way Christians view Jesus Christ. I mean, or the way maybe the Muslims view the Mahdi, or maybe the Buddhists view Buddha as some kind of a semi-divine or divine, in the case of Christianity, a divine messenger or agent of the Lord God, King of the universe. Is that right?
Yes, and like the Hindus view Krishna. Yes, Maitreya, all of those major world religions look for their teacher to return, and Maitreya comes, now that we have worldwide global communication, he comes to fulfill the prophecy of all of the major world religions. But he comes for everybody. He says, if you're in a religion and it's working great for you, good, stay with it. He said, but if you're not, I come for you too. I come for everybody. He comes as a teacher, doesn't come to start a new religion. He comes as a teacher, and he is going to teach humanity how to fix the mess we've made of the world.
Now, the respective messianic figures that I mentioned all had a moral and ethical message for the world and for their followers. In the case of Jesus, that message was the Torah, basically. I mean, the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah, and with its own unique contribution on top of that. My guess that my question for you is, what is the message of your view of a Messiah, the so-called Lord Maitreya? Is there a moral and ethical code that you can illustrate there?
I would say that it's a couple things. He emphasizes the importance of right relationship, that we treat each other well, that we take care of each other, that humanity is one, brothers and sisters all children of the one God. And the second thing is, he says, share and save the world. He says the one thing we haven't tried to do to save the world is for nations to share their excess production with other nations that need that, and then get back what they need. And that he said sharing will solve the problems of the world because it will build trust. And when you have trust, you have peace. And he said that's what's left. We need to share the resources of the world. After all, the resources of the world aren't just here for the wealthy nations. They're here for everybody. And he says we need to share the resources of the world nationally, one nation after another. He's not saying give up your life savings and give it to somebody. That's not his message. His message is share the resources of the world and save the planet.
The idea of, international brotherly love, I mean, that's something that I think most major religions preach. Certainly the Torah preaches that. Love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't mean you admire your neighbor. You may hate your neighbor, but you have to love him in the sense that you have to recognize his basic human rights as you would expect him to recognize yours, even if you are competing, even if you don't like each other.
Right.
That seems to me to be a universal theme here. However, your talk about sharing, that's something that I think we can maybe bicker on how that can be done. I would suggest that the United States is an excellent example of sharing with the rest of the world. I would point to Israel as another example of that. Whereas when you have another nation that is in dire need, if there's a famine, or if there's starvation, or if there's a natural disaster like an earthquake, or there's something that really creates havoc, the United States, at least in terms of our private corporations and our citizens and even our government, comes in and helps. I think that you can see, like, I'll give the example of the earthquake in Haiti. Israel was there with doctors and medical teams. The United States was there. I'm in Boston, my own hospital here. The Mass General sent down a big contingent of doctors and nurses to help people. So I think we already have a model of how to share when nations and people are dealing with catastrophes. But I have a feeling that that's not what you're talking about when you're talking about sharing.
Well, we're not talking just about catastrophes. We're talking about everyday life. We're talking about all the granaries in the Western world that are filled with grain, and if we don't get the right price for it, it rots. It never gets distributed to the world, even though it's excess. It never gets distributed to the rest of the world, and there are no distribution plans set up to do that. Basically, Benjamin Creme was in touch with one of the ascended masters, or masters of the wisdom, they're called, these great spiritual beings that have hung around to inspire humanity behind the scenes, including Krishna and Buddha and Confucius and Jesus and all of those. You know, they all work together. They get along great. They have no egos. And they all work with Maitreya as well. Benjamin Cram's master said that how it's probably going to happen is that the masters were the inspiration behind the United Nations in the first place. And he said that basically how it's probably going to come down is there will be a separate department of the United Nations that will take an inventory of all the resources of the world and what each country produces, and then take an inventory of what each country has in excess. And that then the distribution will be based upon who has excess and who has a need for that excess. And that's basically how the needs of the world will be met. Now, this won't happen overnight, but that's the kind of sharing we're talking about, as well as the sharing you're talking about when there's emergencies. One of the things that's happening right now with the coronavirus is that people's hearts are waking up, they're opening up, and people are helping person to person. These great charitable organizations have stepped up their resources tremendously. And so there's a lot of that going on now. And I think that's one of the lessons we can learn from this pandemic.
I would suggest that another lesson we can learn from the pandemic is the dangers of United Nations organizations and world order, world government, if you will, and how that can be corrupted, because it's been pretty well established, particularly by German intelligence, and this has been a big story in Germany, not so much here, that the World Trade Organization colluded with Communist China at the beginning of the Wuhan virus to hide the fact that this was a contagion for almost 2 weeks. Yes. And once they finally admitted that it was a problem, they continued to insist that it was not going to be spread from person to person. Now, in the course of those 2 critical weeks, people traveled from China to all various parts of the world spreading this virus.
Right.
So we can't trust the UN. The World Health Organization is an agency of the UN. They're corrupt. We cannot, yes. We have to have, in a sense, the only hope we can have in terms of getting at these truths, I would argue, is sovereign nations, is freedom of the press and the ability to investigate. I mean, China would not allow the CDC doctors to even go to Wuhan to see what was going on. So as a result, we have a worldwide epidemic when, if they had cooperated in the beginning, it probably could have been more likely contained, or at least we might have saved a lot of lives and a lot of infection and a lot of dislocation. So I see that, this idea of having some kind of a world order, a United Nations thing, this is a perfect example of where that's not a good idea.
Well, I agree with everything you just said, number one, except that there's corruption in every major institution in the world now. And that's one of the things the pandemic is making even more obvious than ever. All of these organizations, including all of the world's major religions, need to be cleaned out. There is tremendous corruption going on behind the scenes in almost all of the major institutions of the world, number one. Number two, Benjamin Cram's master and Benjamin Cram weren't talking about the United Nations being a world government. There will be no world government, is what he said. Every nation is important. Every nation has its own personality and contributes to the whole. And so this idea of a one world government, people are deathly afraid of that, and rightly so. It's not going to happen if Benjamin Cram is correct, and I think he is, or I wouldn't be here today. So I would agree with you. There's corruption everywhere, including the UN, especially in the Security Council of the United Nations, where 8 countries basically rule the world, and if any one of them disagrees, they have veto power. That's going to go. According to the master, the Security Council needs to go so that the General Assembly is the launching point for all the countries in the world to talk to each other and share their concerns and get feedback. And that's the way it needs to be set up. But yes, there's tremendous corruption in everything right now. That's true. We see from the pandemic that a lot of our social structures need to be changed.
Well, first of all, there's always corruption in government, particularly in public agencies, and to a very high degree in private agencies.
Yes,
Although, generally speaking, I think that the private sector gets a bad rap because they're not as corrupt. I mean, generally, people are trying to make a living and they're trying to offer a reasonable product. But there are examples of corruption. But the system in America, I would suggest, is the best way to balance that corruption by having a diffusion of powers, by having three different branches of the federal government, by having the federal government checked by states, which is in a way how this is
absolutely.
working with the pandemic, having the
Yes,
states checked by communities, and ultimately having all of it checked by the individual who derives his rights and his sovereignty from God, not from the state. That's the
yes,
American system.
yes.
And the idea, in a way, I disagree with you about the UN Security Council, because the Security Council offers a check and a balance to kind of mass corruption on an international level. At least you have a veto by some nations for some of the really excessive things being suggested by various nations, and that the UN really, I think, should serve the role that they publicly proclaimed themselves to serve. You know, what they actually served is another question. And that is simply as a neutral arbiter of conflict in the world, as a keeper of records, and as a diplomatic office for nations who are in conflict and who are quarreling, not as some kind of a world parliament where you can have nations decide on laws and on decrees that might be presented on other nations. I think that the most progressive system that we have is the system of the nation state, of the national sovereignty. And that's a system that is moving in the right direction. I mean, I could give the example of the election of Donald Trump in the United States, the Brexit in England. I mean, the British people, the English people were waking up and discovering that all various aspects of their lives are being regulated by these faceless bureaucrats in Europe. You know, their education of their children, their health and their health care, their general welfare, social issues, things like hate crimes or whatnot, immigration. These things they had lost control of those things, so they reasserted the sovereignty of their nation by exiting that internationally oriented body. And I think that that's a genuine sign of progress, because that's what protects democracy. That's what protects the rights of the individual under God.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground there, Charles. Let me
Okay.
let me just say this. You and I will not agree on a lot of things.
Right.
And it's really important that your viewers know that I'm not here to convince you that what I say is true. Uh, Partially because a lot of what I'm talking about is prophecy, and you can't prove prophecy. You just have to wait and see what happens. But I think it's important prophecy because it gives people a lot of hope. And and so you and I are going to disagree, and it's important that your listeners know I ask two things of them. Number one, please don't believe anything I say, because that would be blind belief, and I can't recommend that to anybody. I'm not here to tell anybody how to think. I'm just here to share my information and let people draw their own conclusions, like you're doing.
Right.
And the second thing is, I would ask your audience to try to keep a little bit of an open mind. Crack the window open a little bit, because we all have our own belief systems that we've built up over the years, our opinions, our thoughts. And so it's very hard to let new thoughts in. And I'm just asking that your listeners try to do that a little bit, because they're going to hear some stuff from me that they haven't heard before, probably. And so it's important that everybody know I'm not here to convince everybody or argue with anybody. I'm just here to give out my information, which I hope is useful to some people, or maybe 10 or 20% of it is useful.
Well, Dick, I think that I would suggest that my audience, which tends to be conservative by nature, is open-minded. I mean, we're
Right.
interested in ideas. We don't follow and goose step along with any agendas. That's what that's the literal definition of conservatism. Um, but I think we are interested in hearing some kind of
Yeah.
new idea from you. We want to hear it so we can think about it, debate it, maybe integrate it if it sounds right. So far, the only new idea that I've heard you suggest is this vague idea that the nations have to share. And I pointed out that we already do, at least in the United States. But I think that you're talking, or you're very quietly alluding to some bigger form of sharing. And I think that that bigger form maybe comes from another one of your great masters, and that great master being none other than Karl Marx. You're talking about an international communist model.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm talking about an international combination of democracy and socialism, a blend of, and by socialism, I don't mean communism. That's a whole different ballgame.
Mm.
I mean, by socialism, I mean that each nation, a socialistic nation, builds a safety net for its people so that everybody has health care. They don't have to worry about that. So that everybody has affordable college education available to them. They don't have to build up a lifetime of debt to go to college. That everybody has food, that everybody, here are Maitreya's first 4 priorities. It's real basic stuff. Housing for everybody, education for everybody, healthcare for everybody, and food for everybody. Now, those are 4 real basic needs. The United Nations even says those are 4 basic rights of each human being, is to have those 4 things. And so his first thing will be to help us figure out how to deliver those 4 things to the rest of the world, so nobody has to die of starvation, nobody has to die of illness without medical treatment, nobody has to live without a home, a house, a roof over their head, and so on. So those are the first 4 priorities, real basic stuff. And I would just counter what you said with this, Charles, and that is, I think I've introduced one other new idea, and that is that there's a great teacher here. Every 2,000 years or so, we get a great teacher sent with a new teaching, and that great teacher is the world teacher Maitreya, who is waiting for the right time to come forward, when most of you will get the attention of most of humanity. So I would suggest that's another new idea I'm proposing.
Okay. I would counter by saying that the great teacher is God, and that if you're Christian, the great teacher is Christ. That we have their message. The Torah has the laws and the principles and the morals of God as delivered at Sinai. Christianity has also Sinai, and it has the ministry of Jesus, which I would suggest echoes Sinai, and it doesn't contradict it. So, I think that the nations of the world, and particularly the United States, they have a system in place that reduces things like poverty and starvation and homelessness and
But
disease.
we're not doing it.
No, I disagree. I think that we're doing it to a high degree. It's not perfect, but there's no such thing as perfection. But if you take a look at the way this society works and the way our charities work, I particularly would send a bouquet to Catholic charities. I think that they're incredible. We have a system. Yeah, we have a system by which if a person is hungry or if they're homeless, they can get help from local charities, from their local community. We have a system that works very well. Now, and we do it without socialism. As far as other nations are concerned, I would suggest that they could look at our model. They don't have to copy it literally. I mean, they certainly could take lessons from it and incorporate it into their own system and their own culture. I think the Catholic Church has been a very great force for that as well, in terms of providing social services and elevating the social importance of taking care of people without government, but through charitable organizations and through people who want to do this, because we do want to do this. Nobody wants to see their fellow citizens starving or homeless. That's natural. I mean, that's part of the better side of our nature. And I think that if we see an organization that achieves these things, we support them and do so with charity and do so by getting involved and volunteering. America has the greatest level of volunteerism and charity in history, and that's because we're not socialist. It's because we're free to do that, to solve these problems. So I don't think that socialism or world kind of, dictates are the answer to that problem. It's never going to be perfect because humanity is never going to be perfect, but we can achieve these goals to a pretty high degree if we let people be who they are and we let people be free. And as far as whether or not there's a Lord Maitreya coming, that's something that, I'll leave that up to my viewers. If that's what you believe in, I respect that belief. That's fine. I don't see anything negative about the Lord Maitreya. I don't see him as being an anti-Semite or a racist or anything like that. So, it seems like it's a rather benign view. I just would put a word of caution in terms of maybe some solutions to a crisis like what we're dealing with now, the coronavirus, as being socialism, which I think is the absolute opposite way to go.
Yeah, I would suggest, again, just don't believe me, just for some thought. We already have a social democracy. Medicare, that's a socialism program. Social Security, the library system, the military. It's all paid for by government, by taxes on the American people are paying for that. That's what socialism is. They collect money and then they provide for everybody. The library system, the highway system, the train system. There's a whole list of things, police departments, fire departments. They're all paid for by American taxes. And that is a socialism program where you collect money from the general funds and you use it to help everybody. And so I would say we have quite a bit of that going on right now. And it's not bad. I think a lot of it is really good stuff. I think some conservatives have this stereotypical thought that the word socialism reminds them of communism and communism is bad and so on. And I'm not saying we should turn into a socialist country. I'm saying that we should be a combination and that we'll probably end up that way. Again, it's prophecy, can't prove it, but we'll probably end up with a little more social safety net than we have right now. Like universities may be free at some point for people to go to school so they can become a dentist and not be in debt for the rest of their life doing it. Things like that.
I think
not that we turn into a socialism country.
No, I get what you're saying. And I think that most of those things that you just mentioned, I would say are not socialist in that they adhere to the principle of subsidiarity. They're local, they're at their usual state programs. They are, the state legislatures decide to the degree that they want to create and fund those programs, and that they're accountable to elected officials, and they can grow or not grow depending upon the local economy and the local interest by governments. And to the degree that they are socialistic, they're probably not as good as they would be if they were privatized. Now, I'm not silly enough to suggest that we're ever going to privatize Social Security or Medicare. I would suggest, however, that if those systems were in a more privatized mode, they'd be better, because Social Security is essentially an annuity fund, and that when it's run by the government, that you don't get, it's not well done. I mean, you don't get interest on that money. You don't get, if you die, you don't get any of it. You have somebody who particularly is burdensome to minorities. I would say that if it was done in a more privatized mode, you'd have a much better nest egg when you retire, and it would be a great way to reduce poverty. Instead, it's a great way, the way it's set up now, to finance a ever-growing government. And I would suggest the same thing could be said about Medicare. However, I'm not silly enough, as I said, to suggest that those systems be removed. I mean, they're never going to be removed any more than the IRS is ever going to be removed. But that doesn't mean that, the socialistic nationalized elements of those are a good thing. I think that they're a drag on all of us. They're a drag on the economy. They're a drag on our freedom. So, we can talk about specific socialistic programs, and you're right to define them that, and talk about better modalities that would actually lead to more prosperity and more freedom and a reduction in poverty. I don't think that the answer is to increase them. The answer is to decrease them, to localize them, and to make sure that they're more locally managed and locally controlled in partnership with private citizens. But again, I'm not an anarchist. I think that the government plays a role, and there should be regulation. But generally, I would err on the side of individual freedom in regard to all of the programs that you mentioned.
Well, I respect your thoughts.
Thank you. All right, Dick. So let my listeners and viewers know where they can reach you or your organization, where they can find out more information about Share International.
Sure. Thank you for asking.
You're welcome.
There's a website. Actually, there's a couple websites. The international one is share-international, all spelled out, .org. Not .com, .org. Share-international.org. And then there's another one, shareinternational.us. And so that's the US website. I would also I'm not here to sell books, but just in case people are interested, Benjamin Creme has written about 17 books on this topic and about prophecy and about a lot of things. And they are available on Amazon.com. We have tried to keep them very reasonably priced so that we basically sell them for cost. And so if anyone is interested, they can just go on Amazon and look up Benjamin Creme. It's spelled Creme, and they can check them out.
Very good, Dick. Listen, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. It's been an interesting talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Charles.